What if I told you that the most dangerous place for a Victorian child wasn't the disease-ridden slum, the smoke-filled factory, or even the coal mine shaft, but the very institution designed to enlighten their minds? We've been sold a romantic lie about Victorian education, a sepia-toned fantasy of strict but caring teachers, orderly rows of eager pupils, and moral instruction that built character and empire. We imagine the schoolhouse as civilization's triumph over ignorance, where the deserving poor finally gained access to knowledge that would lift them from darkness. But strip away this nostalgic veneer, and you'll discover a system built on systematic terror. The Victorian classroom wasn't a temple of learning, it was a laboratory for breaking human spirits. Every great achievement of the era, every engineer who built the railways, every administrator who governed the colonies, every clerk who kept the empire's books, was forged in an educational crucible where pain was pedagogy and fear was the primary curriculum. The real enemy in Victorian schools wasn't ignorance, it was childhood itself. The natural curiosity, energy, and humanity of young people were seen not as assets to be nurtured, but as defects to be beaten out of them. Picture this. You're 6 years old, standing outside an imposing brick building in Manchester on a freezing morning in 1875. Your stomach cramps with hunger because breakfast was a crust of stale bread. Your thin boots offer no protection against the cold cobblestones. But what makes you tremble isn't the weather, it's the sound echoing from within, the rhythmic whistle and crack of cane on flesh, punctuated by muffled cries that are quickly stifled. You're not entering a place of enlightenment, you're entering a battlefield where the war is against your own nature, where a misspelled word could leave you unable to use your hands for days, and where silence is valued more than understanding. The lesson you'll learn isn't reading or arithmetic, it's that pain is the price of being human, and being human is a crime that must be punished daily. Chapter 1. The Fate of Respectability, Temples of Learning or Theaters of Terror. The illusion began with architecture that spoke of noble purposes. As compulsory education spread across Britain following the 1870 Education Act, magnificent new school buildings rose like Gothic cathedrals dedicated to the worship of knowledge. Imposing brick facades, tall windows reaching toward heaven, brass plaques proclaiming for the education of all, or that learning may flourish, these buildings were designed to inspire awe and suggest the transformation of British society through enlightenment. Politicians and reformers spoke in rapturous terms about this educational revolution. Newspapers published glowing accounts of orderly classrooms, where children from the lowest social classes sat in neat rows, their slates before them, absorbing knowledge that would lift them from poverty and ignorance. Philanthropists congratulated themselves on funding these institutions that would create not just literate workers, but moral citizens and loyal subjects of the crown. The official curriculum appeared comprehensive and enlightening. Children would master the famous 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, that would prepare them for productive lives. They would study geography to understand the vast empire they belonged to, history to appreciate their nation's greatness, and religious instruction to ensure their moral development. For the emerging middle class, grammar schools promised classical education, Latin, Greek, mathematics, and sciences that would prepare young gentlemen for university and professional careers. But step through those impressive doors, past the inspirational inscriptions, and you entered a world where the gap between promise and reality was measured in tears and blood. The magnificent buildings were shells, their impressive exteriors concealing interiors that were often worse than the slums many students came from. Those large windows, so promising in architectural drawings, were frequently broken or grimy, admitting cold drafts but little light. Heating was inadequate or non-existent, leaving children shivering through lessons in winter months. The schoolroom itself was designed as a theater of surveillance and control. The gallery system arranged students on tiered benches, facing a raised platform where the master's desk stood like a throne. This panopticon allowed a single adult to monitor and punish dozens of students simultaneously. The benches were backless planks of wood where children were expected to sit upright for hours without moving. For the youngest pupils, barely 5 years old, this physical strain alone was torture. The silence that greeted visitors wasn't the peaceful quiet of concentrated learning. It was the terrified silence of prey animals hiding from predators. In rooms containing 60, 80, sometimes over 100 children, the only sounds were the scratch of slate pencils and the heavy footsteps of prowling masters. This unnatural quiet was maintained through constant threat and regular application of violence. Meet Thomas, a 7-year-old tailor's son, whose nimble fingers could work thread and needle with precision, but trembled when holding a slate pencil. His letters wobbled and danced on the slate, earning sharp raps across his knuckles that left them swollen and purple. When called upon to recite, his throat would close with fear, the correct answers trapped behind walls of terror. In another age, someone might recognize Thomas as dyslexic or simply exhausted from helping his father until midnight. In the Victorian classroom, he was branded as slow, lazy, willfully stupid, moral failings that required correction through pain. The curriculum that looked so comprehensive on paper was delivered through mechanical repetition and mindless drill. Children didn't learn to read by exploring stories or developing comprehension. They chanted letters and syllables in unison until sounds were burned into memory through sheer repetition. The cat sat on the mat, repeated 100 times, until the words lost all connection to actual cats or mats, and became mere sounds produced on command. Religious instruction, supposedly the moral foundation of education, consisted of memorizing Bible verses and catechism responses without discussion of meaning. Children as young as 6 were expected to recite lengthy passages of Scripture perfectly, with any error resulting in punishment. The God they learned about was a deity of judgment and wrath, perfectly aligned with the pedagogical philosophy that governed their daily existence. The orderly rows of students that appeared in official photographs were achieved through a reign of terror, so complete that even natural childhood reflexes were suppressed. A child who coughed, shifted position, or allowed their attention to wander would feel the sharp crack of a ruler across their knuckles or the sting of a cane across their shoulders. The master moved through the aisles like a predator, cane tucked under his arm, searching for the slightest infraction that would justify violence. But the most insidious aspect of this system was how it corrupted the natural bonds between children, turning them into instruments of each other's oppression. To understand how this machinery of fear operated, we must look beyond the master's cane to examine the invisible army of enforcers who made systematic brutality possible. Chapter 2. The Invisible World, Monitors and the Machinery of Betrayal. If the schoolmaster was the general of this grim army, the monitors were his lieutenants, and their existence represents perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of Victorian education. Faced with classrooms of 50 to 100 students and unwilling to pay for adequate professional staff, schools adopted the monitorial system developed by Joseph Lancaster and Andrew Bell. Older, brighter, or simply larger students were deputized to teach and discipline younger ones, creating a hierarchy of oppression that destroyed natural childhood solidarity. Meet Edward, a 12-year-old monitor who stands before a group of 6-year-olds like a miniature tyrant. The son of a shopkeeper, he has been given a taste of power that he wields with the cruelty only children freed from adult supervision can achieve. He holds a pointer in one hand and crucially has authority to report misbehavior to the master. In some schools, he can even administer minor punishments himself. A rap on the knuckles, a twist of the ear, a sharp pinch that leaves no visible mark. This system turned the classroom into a nest of vipers where trust became impossible. Edward wasn't a protector or friend. He was a collaborator whose survival depended on finding fault with those beneath him. If his group failed to recite their verses perfectly, he might be punished by the master. Fear flowed downward like poison, And to save his own skin, Edward had to be ruthless. The psychological impact on younger children was devastating. The person tormenting them wasn't a distant adult authority figure, but a boy who looked just like them, who lived on their street, who played the same games. It bred profound isolation. You couldn't trust anyone. The child sitting beside you might be a spy, ready to whisper your name to curry favor with the monitor. Edward himself was a tragic figure, though few recognized it then. He was being groomed for a specific role in Victorian society: the middle manager, the overseer, the foreman who keeps workers in line for the boss. He learned that power is zero-sum. To have it, you must take it from someone else. He discovered that empathy was weakness and brutality was efficient. These lessons would serve him well when he became a factory supervisor or colonial administrator, ruling others through the same methods that had once ruled him. The monitors often proved more cruel than adult teachers. Where an adult might punish from anger or misguided duty, children punished from insecurity and sadistic curiosity. They invented creative torments, forcing younger pupils to stand on one leg for hours, hold heavy books until their arms shook uncontrollably, or kneel on dried peas scattered across the floor. They would ridicule slow learners and encourage group mockery, creating mob dynamics that crushed individual spirits. In the playground, typically a walled courtyard of concrete or packed earth, the hierarchy established in the classroom continued. This wasn't a space for free play, but a prison yard under constant surveillance. Games were rough and often violent, thinly veiled excuses for sanctioned assault. The weak were systematically targeted. The poor, the shabby, those with physical differences became prey while teachers watched from windows, believing this rough and tumble built character. But perhaps most insidiously, the monitorial system normalized betrayal as a survival strategy. It taught children that success meant aligning yourself with oppressors against your peers. A culture of informing flourished. "Please, sir, Johnson is talking." "Please, sir, Smith didn't wash his hands." These whispers became the currency of the classroom, buying momentary safety at the cost of others' suffering. The system created what we might now recognize as institutionalized trauma bonding, where victims identified with their abusers and perpetuated cycles of violence. The monitor who had once cowered under the cane now wielded it against others, telling himself he was building character, maintaining order, serving a higher purpose. The younger children learned that resistance was futile and survival meant absolute submission to whoever held power over them. Mary, an 11-year-old charity school girl, experienced this betrayal acutely. Bright and curious, she had the misfortune to ask why God allowed some children to suffer more than others during religious instruction. The monitor who reported her irreverent question had been her friend the day before, sharing his bread when she had none. But when faced with the choice between loyalty and safety, he chose to sacrifice her. Mary learned that friendship was a luxury she couldn't afford, that even kindness came with hidden costs. The invisible servants who maintained this system, the school porter who carried additional canes, the matron who tended wounds without asking how they were inflicted, the caretaker who cleaned blood from floors, all participated in the machinery of oppression through their silence. They saw everything but could intervene in nothing, their complicity purchased through their own precarious positions in the hierarchy. But what happened when these children, brutalized and betrayed, were forced to participate in the daily rituals that were supposed to civilize them? How did morning prayers and academic lessons function when delivered through systematic violence? Chapter 3: The Rituals of Submission, When Learning Becomes Suffering. Every school day began with a ceremony designed to break individual will before any learning could commence. The bell's harsh clang cut through fog and frost at 8 in the morning, summoning children to line up in the schoolyard regardless of weather. Rain, snow, or bitter cold made no difference. The formation must be perfect before entry was permitted. Teachers and monitors patrolled the lines like drill sergeants, adjusting positions, straightening postures, striking students who fidgeted or spoke. This ritual could consume 20 minutes while younger children shivered and cried, learning their first lesson: your comfort is irrelevant, and your body belongs to the system. The march into the building was conducted in absolute silence, footsteps echoing on stone floors as a reminder that any sound beyond prescribed movement would send the entire class back outside to begin again. Once seated at their desks, long benches with attached writing surfaces, often carved with the desperate initials of previous generations, students would assume the position, hands folded on the desk surface, back straight, eyes forward. This posture would be maintained for hours with only brief respites, any deviation earning the sharp crack of a ruler or the sting of a cane. The day began with prayers and Bible reading lasting 30 to 45 minutes. Students recited prayers in mechanical unison, their voices rising and falling in hypnotic rhythm. They sang hymns emphasizing duty, obedience, and acceptance of divinely ordained social positions. This wasn't spiritual development, but social control, reinforcing hierarchy through divine authority. God wanted children to obey teachers, just as he wanted workers to obey masters and subjects to obey monarchs. Academic instruction followed the same pattern of mechanical repetition and harsh correction. Reading lessons consisted of choral chanting from primers. The cat sat on the mat repeated 50, 100 times until words lost all meaning and became mere sounds produced on command. Individual reading was psychological torture. A student called to stand and read aloud while classmates listened for mistakes. Every mispronunciation, hesitation, or stumble brought immediate punishment and forced repetition until success or collapse. The instruments of correction were varied and specialized. The cane, thin rattan imported from the colonies, was designed to inflict maximum pain with minimum effort, whistling through air to leave welts that burned for days. The tawse, a heavy leather strap split into tails and hardened by fire, was applied to sensitive palms with enough force to cause immediate swelling and lasting damage. The birch, a bundle of twigs bound together, was reserved for serious offenses and applied to bare buttocks in elaborate rituals of public humiliation. But physical instruments were only part of the arsenal. The dunce cap, a tall conical hat bearing the word dunce, transformed academic struggle into public shame. Children who couldn't grasp long division or Latin declensions weren't given additional help but were branded failures and forced to stand before their peers as living exhibits of inadequacy. This weaponized humiliation created lasting psychological damage, convincing bright children with undiagnosed learning difficulties that they were fundamentally broken. Arithmetic lessons epitomized the system's brutality because mathematics was seen as pure memorization. Students recited multiplication tables in hypnotic chorus. 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, repeated daily until numbers were burned into memory through repetition and fear. Individual testing created intense pressure as children stood before classes while masters fired rapid questions. Any hesitation earned cane strokes to extended palms while classmates watched in terrified silence. The payment by results system introduced in 1862 intensified this brutality by tying school funding directly to examination performance. Teachers became desperate taskmasters who saw students not as children to nurture, but as threats to their livelihood. A slow learner wasn't a pedagogical challenge, but an economic liability. The cane became an instrument of desperation, learn or I starve, stripping humanity from education and turning classrooms into factories for processing human raw material. Writing instruction followed similar patterns of mechanical drill and harsh correction. Students practiced letters on slates according to strict penmanship standards, while teachers patrolled examining each slate and striking those whose letters were imperfectly formed. Again, they would command, and students would erase and rewrite until hands cramped and slates were smeared with anxious sweat. Copybooks contain model sentences that reinforce social messages with every copied line. Idleness is the root of all evil. Children should be seen and not heard. Geography and history became exercises in memorizing lists without understanding relationships or meaning. Students learned counties of England, dates of monarchs' reigns, capitals of empire territories, rivers of Britain, storing and retrieving information on command without processing or analyzing it. They became human databases, programmed to produce correct responses, but never to think critically about the information they contained. In elite public schools like Eton and Harrow, the rituals were more elaborate but equally brutal. Boys endured classical curricula heavy on Latin and Greek, learned through the same methods of rote memorization and harsh punishment used in elementary schools. Academic failures resulted in ceremonial birchings administered publicly before entire schools, with students bent over flogging horses, while headmasters applied birch rods with enough force to draw blood. The fagging system added another layer of ritualized oppression, where younger boys served older students as personal servants, subject to unlimited authority and arbitrary punishment. This institutionalized bullying was justified as teaching humility to younger boys and leadership to older ones, but functioned as a training ground for the hierarchical brutalities that would govern their adult lives as imperial administrators. But what happened when this machinery of systematic oppression finally encountered its limits? When the accumulation of daily violence and psychological torture became too much for human nature to bear? Chapter 4. The Dark Side of Discipline, When Systems Break Children. In the medical records of Victorian Britain, if you knew where to look, you could find the true cost of educational discipline written in broken bodies and shattered minds. Hospital logs noted fractured fingers from ruler strikes, permanent hearing damage from blows to the head, spinal injuries from excessive canings. Asylum records documented children driven to madness by constant terror, their minds fracturing under pressures that would break adult prisoners of war. But most damage never appeared in official records because it was considered normal, even beneficial. A child with bruised hands couldn't write properly, but this was seen as natural consequence of failure, not impediment to learning. Students who flinched at sudden movements, couldn't sleep without nightmares, or developed stutters and nervous conditions were exhibiting character weakness that required more beating, not trauma symptoms needing treatment. The psychological patterns created by this systematic violence would persist throughout these children's lives, serving Victorian social order perfectly. They learned that authority must be feared and obeyed without question, that their thoughts and feelings were irrelevant, that pain was an inevitable consequence of failure. These lessons produced workers who accepted dangerous conditions and starvation wages without protest, soldiers who marched into certain death on command, and parents who perpetuated violence cycles with their own children. Consider Thomas, our tailor's son, who spent 7 years in constant low-level terror, punctuated by moments of acute agony. By age 12, when he left school for factory work, he was perfectly prepared for industrial society. He could follow written instructions, calculate wages, sign contracts he couldn't understand. More importantly, he had learned to accept authority without question, endure discomfort without complaint, see his suffering as natural and inevitable. For girls like Mary, the damage was different but equally profound. While boys were prepared for roles as workers and soldiers, girls were shaped into compliant wives and mothers who would accept subordinate positions without protest. The curriculum emphasized domestic skills alongside basic literacy, but the real lesson was obedience and submission. Girls learned their bodies weren't their own through constant posture corrections, that their thoughts mattered less than men's through exclusion from serious academic study, that their role was serving others through endless domestic task practice. In elite schools, damage was subtler, but no less real. Boys who endured the public school system emerged with entitlement and superiority that served them well ruling an empire, but also with deep psychological scars manifesting as emotional coldness, difficulty forming intimate relationships, and tendency to perpetuate violence in their own families and institutions. The famous stiff upper lip wasn't natural British reserve, it was trauma response. Inability to express emotion learned through years of being beaten for showing weakness. These elite students learned that power meant the right to inflict suffering on hierarchical inferiors. The fag who became fagmaster exercised the same cruelty he had endured. The boy birched by his headmaster would, as colonial administrator, order flogging of native workers without hesitation. Violent cycles perpetuated across generations and empire, with each victim becoming perpetrator in turn. The teachers themselves were victims, though their enforcer positions make them less sympathetic. Many had endured the same brutal education they now inflicted, knowing no other methods. They worked under impossible conditions for inadequate pay, facing constant pressure to produce results satisfying government inspectors. Their frustrations found outlet in violence against students, creating cycles where oppressed became oppressors. Some teachers recognized the system's cruelty and tried reform, using praise rather than punishment, making lessons engaging rather than mechanical, treating students as human beings rather than empty vessels. But these reformers faced enormous resistance from colleagues, administrators, and parents who believed sparing the rod spoiled the child. Many were forced from teaching or learned to conform for survival. Students who resisted faced swift, severe consequences. A child talking back might be beaten so severely they couldn't walk for days. Students organizing protests might be expelled and blacklisted, their futures destroyed. The system tolerated no dissent, no questioning, no suggestion that alternatives existed. But resistance occurred in small, covert ways the system couldn't completely suppress. Students deliberately failed examinations to sabotage the payment by results system oppressing their teachers. They formed secret alliances for mutual protection, warning of approaching monitors or taking collective blame for individual infractions. They preserved humanity through whispered conversations, shared food, and moments of kindness the system tried to eliminate. The long-term health consequences were severe and widespread. Repetitive strain injuries from hours of uncomfortable writing left many with permanent hand and wrist damage. Hearing loss from head blows was common. Malnutrition was exacerbated by stress, with students' bodies unable to properly digest inadequate food. Tuberculosis and infectious diseases spread rapidly in crowded, poorly ventilated classrooms where sick children had no choice but to attend. Psychological damage was even more pervasive, but harder to document. Depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress weren't recognized as medical conditions, so mental health consequences went unacknowledged and untreated. Students developing nervous conditions were seen as morally defective rather than traumatized, with more discipline always prescribed as the solution. The suicide rate among school-aged children was higher than statistics suggested because many deaths were classified as accidents rather than self-inflicted. Children who drowned while swimming alone, fell from heights while playing, or died from patent medicine overdoses might have been escaping unbearable circumstances rather than succumbing to misadventure. But even the most oppressive systems eventually encounter their breaking points, when the human spirit refuses to be completely crushed and demands recognition of its fundamental dignity. Chapter 5. Rebellion and the Price of Progress, When Children Fight Back. The rebellion, when it finally came, arrived not with dramatic confrontation, but through whispers, newspaper articles questioning traditional methods, and quiet work of reformers who had survived the system and were determined to change it. It came through slow recognition that breaking children's spirits might produce obedient workers, but couldn't create the innovative, creative citizens that modern industrial society actually needed. The barring out tradition represented the most dramatic form of student resistance. Physical rebellions where children barricaded themselves inside schoolrooms, locking masters out. These weren't mere pranks but desperate uprisings, collective screams against injustice. Students would pile tables against doors, man windows with improvised weapons, and rule their fortress for hours or days, while authorities raged impotently outside. At Winchester College in 1818, military intervention with bayonets was required to suppress such a rebellion. But resistance also occurred on smaller, more personal scales. Stories emerged of boys who finally snapped, catching raised canes mid-air when they had grown taller than masters realized. ink pots hurled with deadly accuracy, collective refusals to sing or recite, sudden, terrifying silences that weren't fear, but defiance. These moments were rare but revealed the fragility of authoritarian power, showing that it existed only because subjects agreed to submit. The first cracks in the system appeared not from humanitarian concern, but practical considerations. Employers complained that school leavers, while obedient and able to follow instructions, lacked initiative and problem-solving skills. Military recruiters discovered that years of malnutrition and stress had produced a generation physically unfit for service. The Boer War revealed that shocking percentages of British recruits were too weak, sick, or damaged to serve effectively. Educational reformers like Charlotte Mason and Maria Montessori began advocating methods that treated children as human beings rather than empty vessels or wild animals to be tamed. They argued education should develop natural curiosity rather than suppress it, that learning could occur through engagement and interest rather than fear and pain. Initially dismissed as soft-headed sentimentality, their ideas gradually gained acceptance as evidence mounted that less punitive methods produced better educated, healthier, more capable students. The campaign against corporal punishment was long and difficult, facing fierce resistance from those insisting children needed beating to learn respect and discipline. Newspaper editorials warned that banning canes would lead to chaos and moral decay. Parents who had been beaten insisted it hadn't hurt them and was necessary for proper development. Teachers argued that without physical punishment threats, they couldn't maintain classroom order. But reformers persisted, documenting damage that systematic violence caused, sharing stories of children permanently injured or psychologically destroyed by excessive punishment. They pointed to successful schools operating without corporal punishment, demonstrating that alternative discipline methods were not only possible, but more effective. They appealed to changing sensibilities about childhood and human rights, arguing that 1850 standards shouldn't be acceptable in 1900. Changes came incrementally and unevenly. Some schools and teachers abandoned corporal punishment voluntarily, while others clung to traditional methods well into the 20th century. Regulations limiting severity and frequency of physical punishment were introduced, though enforcement remained inconsistent. The cane remained legal in British schools until 1986, more than a century after Victorian discipline's worst excesses were first documented and criticized. The legacy extends far beyond individuals who endured it. Psychological patterns it created, associating learning with fear, accepting authority without question, believing suffering builds character, persisted for generations. Parents beaten in school beat their own children at home, perpetuating violence cycles. Teachers trained in punitive methods struggled to adopt humane approaches. Cultural belief that children needed harsh discipline to become productive adults remained deeply embedded long after the Victorian era ended. Yet the system also created its own opposition. Many survivors became determined to ensure future generations wouldn't endure their suffering. They became reformers, educators, advocates for children's rights. They wrote memoirs documenting witnessed and experienced abuses. They worked to create different education recognizing children as human beings, with rights and dignity, rather than raw material to be shaped through violence. Looking back from our present moment, it's tempting to see Victorian educational discipline as a relic we've moved beyond. But the impulse that drove that system, believing children must be controlled through force, that natural impulses must be suppressed rather than channeled, that education should produce compliant citizens rather than develop human potential, hasn't disappeared. It resurfaces in every call for stricter discipline. Every argument that schools have become too soft, every suggestion that children need more structure and less freedom. The Victorian schoolroom represents an extreme expression of these impulses, but the underlying philosophy remains influential. We still struggle with questions about education's purpose, the balance between discipline and freedom, children's rights versus adult authority. We still debate whether learning should be driven by curiosity and engagement or external pressure and consequences. The children who sat in those Victorian classrooms deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals who endured something that should never have been inflicted. Their suffering wasn't necessary for progress, civilization, or empire. It was the cost of a system that valued order over humanity, treating children as means to economic and political ends rather than ends in themselves. So when you hear stories of Victorian education's strict discipline and character building, remember what those euphemisms concealed. Remember the 5-year-old learning to read while his hands were beaten bloody. Remember the girl whose spirit was systematically crushed to prepare her for submission. Remember the boy who learned that showing emotion meant weakness, and weakness meant punishment. Could you have survived in a Victorian schoolroom? Could you have maintained your sense of self while every natural impulse was beaten out of you? Could you have learned to love knowledge while every mistake brought pain? Could you have emerged without deep psychological scars? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what aspect of Victorian educational discipline shocked you most, or whether you see echoes of these methods in modern schooling. And if you want to uncover more hidden truths about history, the uncomfortable realities behind grand narratives we've been taught, make sure to subscribe and join us as we continue examining the past with unflinching honesty. Because the real story of human progress isn't found in official histories, celebrating great achievements and noble intentions. It's found in schoolrooms and factories, workhouses and slums, where ordinary people endured extraordinary suffering to build the world we inherited. Their pain deserves acknowledgement, their humanity honored, and their stories told, especially when that truth is harder to bear than the comforting myths we've been taught.